we're less in distance for now.
But right now, it's Mr. H.
Right. Not many people here know that you speak Chimp. I did speak Chimp yesterday. And if you could just start off this conversation with a greeting in Chimp. My Chimp's not very nice on actually.
Well, I'm going to surprise you, actually. Because first of all, the chimpanzee greeting that I would use if I'm especially greeting the people at the back of the room, the distance call, and who? Which means, hello, here I am, who's out there? But now there's another greeting. And for this, I'm afraid you're going to have to stand up. Okay? And now, you are the male.
Okay.
Right? In chimpanzee society, the male is dominant and the female is always a little bit submissive. That's the way it is in chimp society. So, as a male, you don't put your hands behind your back, you're kind of out here. You're big, and we haven't seen each other for a while, right? And so you're kind of, the big aggressive male. And, right. So I'm a little bit nervous because I'm just a female in chimp society. Right? And so I approach you, and you make no sound at all. I approach you, and I make the submissive greeting, which is, and I come up to you a little bit nervously, but actually you like me. So as I approach, you reach out and you pat my head. And this encourages me, so I come.
Today I'm going to start off by wanting you to take us on your journey that you took almost 40 years. 50 years, excuse me. Take us back to when you first arrived in Africa. And more so, Gombe, what's your first impressions?
All right, well, let me take you, since we're here in Nairobi, let me take you back to when I first arrived in Africa, which was the result of my childhood dream that I would grow up, go to Africa, live with animals, and write books about them. And everybody laughed at me, and they told me that, Africa was still back then, and we're going back to, when between World War I and II, when I was growing up, long time ago. And Africa in England was still thought of as the dark continent. We didn't know much about it. And as I say, World War II was raging. My family had very little money. Very little money. We couldn't afford a bicycle, never mind a motor car. And I was a girl. And some of you will remember that back then girls didn't have these opportunities. So everybody laughed at me and told me to dream about something that was realistic, except my mother. And she said, if you really want something, you work hard and you never give up, you will find a way. So that was the upbringing I had. So eventually I left school, my friends all went to college, we couldn't afford it. I wasn't good in the foreign language, so I couldn't get a scholarship. Again, it was my mother, she said, do a secretarial course and maybe you can get a job in Africa. So I did that, then I got a job in London, then I got an invitation from a school friend whose family had moved to Kenya, which is why I think this is important for tonight, and she invited me for a holiday. Well, this was the opportunity, but there wasn't enough money. I didn't have money. So I left the job I had in London, because you could not save up in those days in London. You couldn't. It was after the war. And I worked in a hotel. I worked for about 4 months, served breakfast, lunch and dinner, and eventually had enough money saved up and bought a return ticket by boat, because that was the cheapest in those days. And came on to Kenya Castle, arrived in Mombasa, got on the train, came up to Nairobi to meet my friend. So my first arrival in Africa was Mombasa to Kenya on the railway. And I saw my first animals, wild animals from that train from Mombasa to Kenya. Way more wild animals than you see today, that's for sure. And then met my friends and my parents in Nairobi, and they took me up to what was then the White Islands, the Goodall. And we saw on the road close up giraffe, and we saw, I didn't realize how rare this was, saw a aardvark. And I had no idea how rare it was, but it was wonderful to see. And we got up to the Goodall, and the very first morning I woke up, they came excitedly to me and said, come out, look what happened last night. And they showed me the paw prints of a leopard who'd come around the building, these things you can put your fist in. So that was my arrival in Africa, was actually here, right here. And then, of course, eventually I met Louis Leakey, and he gave me the opportunity to go and study chimpanzees. And so it took a year for him to get the money for me to go and study chimpanzees because I had no degree. And then the British authorities in what was then Tanganyika said, we're not taking responsibility for a young girl with no degree. It's ridiculous. But in the end, it was Louis Leakey's sister. They said, all right, she has to have a companion. So who came with me? That same amazing mother. So when I arrived at Gombe in 1960, I was with my mother. We went by road. We went with the botanist from what was then the Corinda Museum, now the Natural History, the National Museum, and got there. And what happened when we got there? The Belgian Congo had revolted, and Kigoma was filled with Belgian refugees. So we couldn't go straight to Gombe, but we did in the end.
What was it like when you saw your first chimpanzee?
It was awful. It was the first time I saw a chimpanzee. It took one look at me and ran away. Chimpanzees had never seen a white gate before. And that's what I was. And for months they ran away. And it wasn't until one of them, David Brazier, began to lose his fear that I began to get over this hurdle of, chimpanzees. Well, they're very conservative.
I love the way you use the phrase, lose their fear. And I watched that video, you said to the fuse. How long did that process take?
It took months, and initially I had money for 6 months only. And 3 months went by, and the chimpanzees were still running away, and I wasn't finding out anything. 4 months went by. My mother was only there for 4 months. And thank God she was, because she was the one who boosted my morale. She was the one who said, but Jane, you're sitting up on that peak. You are learning how chimps move around in small groups and sometimes join up when there's a good food. You're learning about what they eat. You're learning how they bend over branches and make beds or nests every night. You are learning a lot. And it was very sad. The big breakthrough observation of chimpanzees picking pieces of grass and using them as tools to fish for termites was just after she left. She would have been so excited. So that was the breakthrough. That was what brought the National Geographic in.
And just exposed the world to that great finding. It was also you exposed them to Flo and Flint. Maybe you could tell us who Flo and Flint were. Well,
David Brazier was the first to lose his fear. And because of him, the other chimpanzees began to realize, well, she can't be so scary after all, because I'd come up to a group in the forest, they were ready to run as usual, and if David Brazier was there, he'd sit calmly, and I suppose they thought, well, she can't be as frightening after all. And so he began to introduce me to his friends in the forest. And because he'd been to my camp to eat palm nuts, but found bananas lying around and taken them, and I'd asked my Tanzanian cook to leave bananas out. And so other chimpanzees began following him to camp and taking bananas. And one of the first females he introduced me to was the old female Flo. And she had an infant, Flint, and she had a daughter, Fifi. And she had two sons, Bigger and Baby, and gradually I got to know them. And they were really the first family that helped me understand the importance of family bonds and how these can last through life.
You have done something that had not been done before. You did this number of chimpanzees, you named them. Why did you choose to do that?
Well, I think that almost anybody in my position would have done the same. I mean, I wasn't a scientist, I haven't been to university. The thought of giving an animal a number, I mean, how many people here have had dogs or cats or rabbits or things? Have you ever thought of giving them a number? Well, I think of giving my chimpanzees a number. But when I got to Cambridge University, he told me how to get a degree. I was told it wasn't scientific to give the chimpanzees names. And I was also told it's not scientific to talk about them having personalities or minds capable of thought. And absolutely don't talk about them having emotions like happiness, sadness, fear, despair. That's all those things are unique to humans. But you see, I had a wonderful teacher when I was a child who taught me absolutely the professors were wrong. And that was my dog. So anybody who had a dog, a cat, a rabbit, a horse, I don't care what it is, and have shared your life in a meaningful way with that animal, know that the professors were wrong. Of course, we're not the only beings with personalities, minds, and feelings, are we? You would agree, wouldn't you?
Absolutely. And what's the thing that chimpanzees have taught you about us as human beings? Because I've read you say, that you were very fond of them, but were better than human beings. But what lessons have they taught you about humanity?
Well, what they taught me is that there's no sharp line dividing us from the other animals, that we're part of the animal kingdom. I've learned from various studies that have been done over the years that biologically chimpanzees are more like us than any other living creature, that the DNA of humans and chimps differs by only just over 1%, that when they're communicating non-verbally, kissing, embracing, holding hands, patting on the back, swaggering, shaking the kiss, throwing things, same sort of things we do, and clearly in the same kind of context. And it was a big shock to me to find that, like us, they're capable of violence and brutality and a kind of primitive war, but equally, like us, they're capable of compassion and altruism and love. So on both sides of the spectrum, we can see how we're similar. But at the same time, we have to ask, how are we different? Because you will not get a group of chimpanzees sitting in a room like this with a microphone that hopefully is working and talking. So the big difference, I think, is the explosive development of the human intellect. And that has led us in some ways to destroy our planet with weapons of mass destruction, with chainsaws that can destroy a forest in a few hours, and all these bad things we're doing to the environment. At the same time, the human brain is beginning to work out solutions to learn how to live in better harmony with the world. So, we learn how we're similar, but how we're different.
And that's a message that you've taken now, people who you're passionate about talking about the environment now. Maybe you could tell us a bit about Roots for Shoots.
Roots and Shoots.
Roots and Shoots, sorry.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit more about that.
I will, absolutely, because it's my passion. So to go back for a second to what we were talking about, the fact that we humans are destroying the planet. To ask ourselves, how is it that a species that's the most intellectual that's ever walked on the planet is destroying its only home. To say to ourselves, we're so amazing in our intellect, we've designed a rocket that has taken people, that has taken equipment to Mars. Oh, okay, we took people to the moon. But we've also launched a rocket to Mars, the red planet, billions and billions of miles away, that has landed on Mars and opened out. And out of this rocket came a little robot that's still crawling about on the surface of the red planet, taking photographs and sending them back. But that's amazing. It's amazing. So, asking again, how is it that the most intellectual creature that ever walked the planet is destroying its only home? And I can only think that we've lost a certain wisdom that some of the older people once had, and some of them still do today, where they would make a decision based not on how does this help me now, or me and my family now, or the next shareholders meeting, which is how we tend to make major decisions today, based on how does this decision that we make today help our people generations ahead. That's how decisions used to be made. So what's happened? There seems to be a disconnect between the head and the heart. And I believe that the only way that humanity can move forward to achieve its full potential is to join the head and the heart. So how do we do it? It comes to the young people. You asked me the question about young people. And as I began traveling around the world talking about the problems that face the environment, chimpanzees, and all the other animals on the planet today, actually, as well as us, I kept meeting young people who seemed to have lost hope. Young people who felt that there was no point in living anymore. And some of them were depressed, some of them were angry, some of them were just apathetic. It doesn't seem to matter what we do because it's all hopeless. And of course, if young people lose hope, there is no hope. And when I began realizing that young people were losing hope, and I thought about my own grandchildren, and thought about how we've harmed this planet since I was that age, and feeling a kind of desperation and anger and shame. And one day, meeting with a group of young people, 12 of them, high school students, and they were on my veranda in Goodall, Tanzania. And they were there because they were concerned about what was going on in the world around them. They were concerned about the environment, they were concerned about street children, they were concerned about the wildlife crisis going on. And so we sat on my veranda and we talked, and from that grew Roots and Shoots. Roots and Shoots is a program that today involves young people in many countries, but back then the main message that I decided was the most important for young people is that every single one of us makes a difference every single day, and we have a choice. What sort of difference are we going to make today? And so these 12 young students went back to their schools. They found young people who felt like they did. We got together, and that led to this program where the main message is every single individual makes a difference every day. And because chimpanzees are like, it's almost as though they are in-between creatures. Humans on the one side. At one time we were told there was a sharp line, and that divided us from the rest of the animal kingdom. And we were the only beings on the planet capable of having personalities and minds and feelings. That's what I was taught. And the chimpanzees taught us that wasn't true. And so from the beginning, the chimpanzees kind of stood in the middle. And imagine, they reach out to you and they say, you're human beings, you're chimpanzees. Don't you think you should bring us into your circle of compassion? And if we dare reach out and hold a hand, So, you know, the whole message of Roots and Shoots and the Jane Goodall Institute is, what do you care about? We're not asking people to help to protect chimpanzees if they're not interested in chimpanzees. Why should they? Maybe they're interested in elephants. Maybe they're interested in dogs. But maybe they're interested in street children or old people, or, you know. So what we encourage, whether it's Roots and Shoots or any of our programs, is to bring people in to become involved in something they are passionate about. And that, I think, is when you get the best out of people. So it's because we've always had a holistic approach. Like, the moment I realized that we could not possibly even try to save chimpanzees while people were struggling to survive was when I flew over Gombe in the early 90s from a small plane and looked down and saw we had a little oasis of forest, a beautiful forest. It was tiny, it's only 30 square miles. And I know you have some tiny forests in Kenya. I was reading about them today. So this is one of your small forests. But when I looked down, I was horrified to see that where there had been unbroken forest all the way along the Rift Escarpment in 1960. By 1990, forests had gone outside Gombe. It wasn't just deforestation beginning, it had gone. It was bare hills. It was shocking. It was absolutely shocking. And so that was when I had this epiphany that how can we even try to save chimpanzees when people are having this terrible time? And that began our program, which we call Take Care of Cry, which we're now spreading to other countries, but which began in Tanzania, around Gombe, which was totally holistic. So I think that the most important part of this program is that we had a wonderful project manager, George Strumden, who'd been in Tanzania like 15, 20 years. And he put together a team of Tanzanians. So it wasn't a group of white, arrogant people going into the villages and saying, hey, you've made a mess, we're going to tell you what to do to make your lives better. It was a team of local Tanzanians going into the villages, sitting down, talking to the elders, talking to the women and saying, what do you think we could do that would make your lives better? And starting with what they wanted. Better food production, better health facilities and better education for their children. That's where we began. And then brought in water projects, protection of watershed, reforestation, and my key thing, microcredit, especially for women, which I think is just, you know, really, really important. And it's changed the lives of so many people. But also scholarships to keep girls in school, because all over the developing world, as women's education improves, family size tends to drop. And what do we find in so many places? So many people, more than the land can support. So family planning is very important in what we do. We've actually been congratulated by the Tanzanian government for taking the lead in family planning in this whole week. So that's, you know, this is our way of trying to do conservation, to get the people and the young people to be our partners. And what's the point of saving anything if the young people aren't going to be better stewards than we've been?
You meet lots of politicians, heads of state, ministers. Are they listening now more, and are you taking the same message to them, or what are you telling them? Are you seeing any commitment coming from their part in just trying to balance conservation and the obligations as government?
Well, I think they are. I think they're beginning to see the writing on the wall. I think people are beginning to understand that, you know, if we continue destroying the environment, there's not much future. But the extent to which they listen and take action really does not depend on them per se. It depends on their constituency. Because you can say what you like about a politician, but I've known politicians who go into politics really with, you know, great passion. I'm going to go in, I'm going to change the world. But if you don't have at least 50% of your constituency backing you, it's not going to work, because either you say, okay, I'm not going to be a politician, and you retire, or you say, well, I want to go on being a politician, so you capitulate on some of your ideals. So we always blame the politicians, but we have to blame the people too. We're all in it together. You know, you and I, we have a role to play. Because in a democracy like Kenya, it's the people who elect the politicians. And the politicians will, at least sometimes, do what the people want them to do. I know they don't always do it, but that's what we have to, that's the goal, right? The ideal is that in a democracy, the people will be able to direct the course of the decisions that are made by government. And I know it doesn't always work.
Earlier on you mentioned women, you mentioned girl child and education and family planning. I'm going to take you back to when you started getting involved in animal conservation. There weren't very many women, and this is a question from the floor. You broke into a field that was traditionally dominated by men. What challenges did you face and how did you overcome that?
You know, it's kind of funny. As I told you earlier, I was told when I first dreamed of Africa I couldn't do it because women didn't do that sort of thing. How did I overcome the challenges? I had this extraordinary mother and really the whole family. So, whereas everybody else said, Jane, dream about something you can achieve, I had a mother and her immediate family saying, you know, don't give up on your dream. So that was how I was brought into it. And then, quite honestly, came out here, met Louis Leakey. He gave me the opportunity to study chimpanzees. And people were saying what they said. And I thought, well, as long as I go and get the money to study these chimpanzees, I don't care what the people say. I want to just be responsible to Louis Leakey. And if people say that I've done it wrong, that you know, women can't do this sort of thing, well, A, I was doing it, so I could do it. And so I was just really lucky.
Did you face much opposition when you were in Cambridge to do your PhD from other men in the work that you had done?
Yeah, I was told I'd done everything wrong. You know, animals don't have personalities, minds and feelings, and I shouldn't have attributed those states to them. And, you know, but again, because of my dog, who gave me this confidence, and my mother, who always said, if somebody doesn't agree with you, the first thing to do is listen to them. And if you still don't agree with them, then have the courage of your conviction. So it was my upbringing, and you know, I was just really lucky. I was in the right place at the right time. There wasn't really much competition. There was nobody else much out there. There weren't millions of people doing PhDs as there are now. So I guess I had it my own way a bit.
The fact that you didn't even have a first degree or master's and then you went straight into, you were fast-tracked into the PhD program, did that also cause resentment amongst your contemporaries then?
Massive resentment, and it was also very, very tough for me. I felt completely, you know, I just felt that it wasn't really fair, that this shouldn't happen. And why should I be there? Why should I be different? And it wasn't until I wrote the first big book, The Chimpanzees of Gombe, that I personally had to go and learn about all the things I would have learned about to get a BA. That I then could stand up and hold my head high and confront other scientists without feeling that I was a kind of, you know, charlatan.
You were able to at least confront the people who doubted your abilities or questioned you back in Cambridge. But when you were in Gombe, when you were alone, when you went through those dark periods, there was no other questions. How did you get by?
I got by the same way that, you know, my mother had said, never give up. And I couldn't give up. And I knew inside myself that if I just stuck it out and I was there and I could get enough money, or Louis could get enough money for me, that it would come out okay in the end, and it did.
Tell us about memorable moments with the chimpanzees in Gombe, a time that actually moved you very, very deeply.
Well, one of the first amazing, extraordinary moments was with the same David Graybeard who demonstrated tool using, the first chimpanzee who let me actually follow him through the forest. So on this one occasion, I'm following him. It was like in the first year of the study, maybe early in the second year, I can't remember. And he went through a thick tangle of vegetation. He veered off the trail. And I lost him because, you know, he can just walk through and you get caught up by your hair, your clothes. I mean, you know, we're not concerned, well, the pygmies are, but I'm not anyway. So I lost him. And I thought, well, never mind, I'll find him another day. But when I finally got through this horrible tangle of thorny vegetation, there was David Graybeard sitting as though waiting for me. Maybe he was. How do we know? He was sitting, looking back, and it just looked as though he was waiting for me. And I sat down near him. And lying on the ground between us was a ripe red palm nut. And so I picked it up and held it out to him on my hand. So you David, turn your head away. Turn your head away. Right. So I put my hand closer. He turned, he looked directly into my eyes, and he reached out, he took the nut, he didn't want it, he dropped it. But then he very gently squeezed my fingers, which is how chimpanzees reassure each other. So in this moment, it was the most perfect communication. We understood each other. He understood that my motive was good, to offer him, even though he didn't want it. I understood he didn't want it, but that he understood why I'd given it to him. And it was the most extraordinary. I didn't follow him when he left. I just sat there and thought about this extraordinary moment that had really helped me to understand how close we actually are, that we can communicate at this basic level. And you know, that was probably the first amazing moment. Another one was when the old female Flo, who had started off afraid of me, but you know, she's become the great matriarch that everybody knows if they read anything about Gombe. And she had a little infant Flint, and she had suddenly come to trust me so much that her little infant was about, I don't know, 4 or 5 months, just able to walk. And she actually allowed him to come right up to me. She kept her hand around him, but she didn't stop him. And he reached out and he touched my nose.
Wow.
And it was so extraordinary, this little infant reaching out with those big round eyes, and his mother trusting me enough to let him do that. So that was another amazing moment.
You mentioned the Graybeard, Flo, and Flint losing their fear of you. Was there a time that when you also lost your fear of them?
I didn't have fear of them. I had nervous moments because chimpanzees are, you know, 10 times stronger than me. And when they began to lose their fear, they began to treat me, they became aggressive as though I was a leopard. And they tried to make me go away. And that was very scary because they would go up in the trees. They had this fierce call, and they would sway the tree branches, and sometimes the branches would hit me. And one of them once came up behind me on the ground, hit my head. And you know, that was a scary, scary time. They wanted to drive me away, but I wouldn't go. And I pretended I wasn't interested. When they did all this stuff, I was, you know, pretending to eat little bits of twig and digging little holes in the ground. I wasn't interested in them. So finally they gave up. They said, okay, okay. Well, here she is. She's part of our environment. It was quite strange. Yeah.
What do you feel like when you go back to Gombe now. I know you go there often.
Yeah, I just came.
Yeah.
Sad.
What's that?
Because, okay, I know a lot of the older children of the chimps I knew so well back in the 60s and 70s when I was living there. But my old friends have gone, they've died. You know, they can live to be 60, but the older ones have gone. I had this amazing time that some people have had the luck to experience when Gombe was for me. There was nobody there. It was just me, a few Tanzanian research assistants, and then gradually 1 or 2 foreign students. That was it. But today, there's big national parks presence, tourists, rules and regulations. It is no longer a contiguous forest. It's you know, surrounded by human settlement. So it's sort of sad, and yet when I get out in the forest on my own, and I always do that every time, I can close my eyes and take deep breaths, and I can actually be back as it was, and that regenerates my spirit.
You feel like encroached in your home, or you call Gombe home?
It's a spiritual home, in a way, but it has been encroached upon. It's not like it was. I have to say it's not like it was. So, you know, in a way, spiritual home is also the house where I grew up when I was a child, which we still have. Me and my sister own it jointly. When I go back there, the trees are the trees that I looked at when I was a child, reading about Africa and Tarzan and all that stuff. So that's a very spiritual home too. That's where I've written all my books.
I'm going to ask, what your mom was key there in sparking your sense of adventure? I read you also had a sense of curiosity as a child. Is it true you sit down and wait for chickens hatch?
This was a great story, actually.
So it is true.
I think, yeah, the first piece of it, you can go back before that, was when my mother came, and I don't remember this. She came into my room, and she found I'd taken a whole handful of wriggly earthworms to bed with me. And she said, you know, Jane, I looked and you were watching them as if you wondered, how do they walk without legs? And anyway, whereas many mothers would say, oh, throw these dirty things out, she just said very quietly, if you leave them here, they're going to die because they need the earth. And so together we took them back to the garden. That was number one. Second one, we lived in London, not so many animals, you know. And then we went for a holiday when I was 4.5 years old. And some of you may have children and grandchildren, 4.5 years, so think about that child. And so we went to stay on a farm in the country. It was my father's mother's farm. And cows, pigs, horses, face to face. I mean, wow. Can you imagine for a child living in London who loves animals, how exciting that was? And I was given this job of collecting hen's eggs. And in those days, there were no cool battery farms. And the hens pecked around in the farmyard. They were supposed to lay their eggs in these little hen houses, probably about this high, I don't know. It seemed huge when I was a child. And there were nest boxes around the edge. So my job was to collect the hen's eggs, and I got this little basket, and would open the lids of the nest boxes. If there was an egg, I popped it in my basket. But you know, here's an egg, right? So apparently, I don't remember this, but apparently I began to ask everybody, where does the egg come out of the hen? Because I couldn't see a hole like that. So nobody answered me to my satisfaction. So what I remember distinctly, 4.5, remember, seeing a hen, and she went up, they had a little plank leading into the hen house, which was closed at night to keep the foxes out, and thinking, she's going to lay an egg. So I crawled after her. Big mistake. With squawks of, I suppose, fear, she flew out.